Before her name ever appeared in news reports, before courtroom testimony and legal arguments defined the narrative, Kayla Hodgson was simply a 23-year-old young woman trying to build a life for herself in South Florida. She lived in Tamarack, a quiet residential community known more for its calm neighborhoods than for violent headlines. For Kayla, it was a place of independence, routine, and the beginning of adulthood. At 23, life is often a mixture of ambition and uncertainty. It's an age where dreams still feel very close, where plans are flexible, and where the future seems wide open. Kayla was in that stage, navigating relationships, work, responsibilities, and personal growth. Friends described her as someone who was figuring things out step by step, determined to stand on her own and create stability for herself. She wasn't someone seeking drama or conflict. She was focused on living her life. Her apartment in Tamarack represented more than just a physical address. It symbolized independence. It was her space, a place she decorated, organized, and returned to at the end of long days. For many young adults, having a place of their own is a milestone, proof that they are moving forward. For Kayla, that apartment was part of that journey. It reflected a young woman stepping confidently into adulthood, handling her responsibilities, and building something that belonged entirely to her. Family members later described her as warm and loyal, someone who valued her relationships deeply. She maintained close connections with relatives and stayed in touch with friends who had known her for years. She was the kind of person who showed up when needed. If someone was struggling, she would listen. If someone needed support, she would offer it. These details may seem small, but they paint a picture of who she truly was beyond the headlines. To her loved ones, Kayla wasn't defined by a single moment in time. She was remembered for her laughter, her conversations, her expressions, and her presence at family gatherings. Holidays, birthdays, casual visits, she was part of those memories. And like many young people, she was evolving. She had interests, personal goals, and plans that were still forming. Life wasn't static for her, it was moving forward. Those who knew her say she enjoyed simple, everyday moments, quiet evenings, conversations with friends, time spent unwinding after work. There was nothing extraordinary or dangerous about her daily routine. It was normal, the kind of normal that millions of young adults experience across the country. That sense of normalcy is what makes what happened later feel even more shocking.
In the months leading up to her death, there were no public signs that her life was in danger, no visible indicators that a devastating event was approaching. From the outside, everything appeared ordinary. She was living, working, communicating, and planning ahead like anyone else her age. Her future still seemed unwritten. When tragedy struck, it didn't just end a life, it froze all the potential that came with it. The plans she had, the relationships she was building, the personal growth she was experiencing, all of it was abruptly cut short. For her family, the loss wasn't abstract, it was deeply personal. It meant an empty seat at the table, unanswered phone calls, celebrations that would never feel complete again. Grief in cases like this extends far beyond the crime scene. It moves into living rooms, into memories, into everyday life. The people who loved Kayla were left trying to reconcile the person they knew with the violent act that ended her life. They had to hear her name repeated in news broadcasts and courtroom proceedings, each mention a reminder of what had been taken from them. Understanding Kayla's background is not about creating sympathy through tragedy. It is about restoring humanity to someone who was reduced to a case file. True crime stories can easily focus on suspects, motives, and shocking details, but at the center of every case is a human being whose life mattered long before the crime occurred. Kayla Hodgson was more than a victim. She was a young woman in transition, learning, growing, making choices, and shaping her future. She had friendships that mattered. She had family bonds that were strong. She had private hopes that will now never be fulfilled. Her story does not begin with violence. It begins with a normal life in a quiet Florida city. It begins with routine days and ordinary ambitions. It begins with a 23-year-old woman who believed she had time to grow, to love, to succeed, and to experience everything life still had to offer. And that is what makes the loss so profound. Because before investigators, before prosecutors, before juries, there was simply Kayla, a daughter, a friend, a young woman whose life was real, meaningful, and deeply valued by those who knew her. This is the foundation of the case. A life lived, a future interrupted, a presence that can never be replaced. As investigators began piecing together what led to the killing of Kayla Hodgson, attention quickly shifted toward a growing conflict rooted in jealousy, emotional tension, and a complicated romantic history. What at first seemed like an isolated act of violence slowly revealed a deeper story, one involving unresolved feelings, perceived betrayal, and an escalating fixation.
At the center of that tension was Sakina Thompson, a woman from New York who had previously been in a relationship with the man Kayla was reportedly seeing. That connection, indirect yet emotionally charged, would later become a key element in understanding motive. Romantic triangles are not uncommon. Breakups happen, new relationships form, most people eventually move on. But according to prosecutors, this situation did not follow a typical path of closure. Instead, it allegedly evolved into resentment and emotional instability. Investigators later suggested that feelings of jealousy intensified over time, particularly as social media interactions added fuel to the fire. In modern relationships, social media can amplify emotions. Seeing photos, posts, and updates can reopen wounds that might otherwise begin to heal. In this case, reports indicated there had been online tension, including blocking and communication disputes. While none of this is illegal on its own, it painted a picture of emotional conflict brewing beneath the surface. For the prosecution, the motive was rooted in romantic jealousy. They argued that Thompson was unable to accept the end of her previous relationship and the idea that someone else, Kayla, had stepped into that space. The situation allegedly shifted from heartbreak to obsession. What may have started as anger or hurt feelings eventually transformed into something far more dangerous. Court records later revealed that Thompson traveled from New York to Florida. That detail alone raised serious questions. Traveling across state lines requires planning, booking transportation, coordinating timing, and making deliberate decisions. Prosecutors argued this was not an impulsive reaction, but a calculated move driven by emotional intensity. From their perspective, the motive wasn't just about a former boyfriend. It was about control, rejection, and perceived replacement. When someone struggles to accept loss, emotions can distort rational thinking. In extreme cases, resentment can grow into fixation. According to the state's case, that fixation centered on Kayla. The defense, however, painted a different narrative. They suggested the meeting was not intended to end in violence. Instead, they implied that emotions spiraled out of control during a confrontation. But even within that framework, the existence of tension was undeniable. Witness testimony and digital evidence reportedly highlighted communication patterns leading up to the incident. While the specifics were dissected in court, the broader theme remained clear. Unresolved emotional conflict had been building. It is important to understand that motive in cases like this rarely forms overnight. Emotional escalation often happens gradually. Hurt feelings can turn into anger. Anger can evolve into blame. Blame can transform into fixation. When combined with proximity, access, and opportunity, that emotional storm can become volatile. Kayla, by all accounts, was living her life and continuing forward. From the prosecution's standpoint, she was not seeking confrontation, yet she became the focal point of someone else's unresolved emotions. Jealousy is one of the most powerful human emotions. It can cloud judgment and override logic. In many criminal cases involving romantic rivals, the underlying theme is not just love lost. It is ego, pride, and the inability to accept change. Prosecutors argued this case followed that tragic pattern. As the courtroom proceedings would later show, the alleged motive became one of the most debated elements of the trial. Was this premeditated revenge fueled by jealousy, or a confrontation that escalated beyond control? Those questions would ultimately be left to a jury. But what remains undeniable is that behind the legal terminology of motive lies a human reality, emotional conflict that spiraled into irreversible consequences. The relationship tension, layered with jealousy, digital communication, and unresolved attachment, became the bridge between ordinary life and extraordinary tragedy. It marked the turning point where private emotions crossed into criminal action. And in the end, That emotional storm would have devastating, permanent consequences for everyone involved. In any homicide investigation, emotions and speculation eventually give way to one critical element: the timeline. When detectives began reconstructing the final hours leading to the death of Kayla Hodgson, they focused on movements, digital footprints, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence. What they assembled was not just a sequence of events, but a detailed roadmap of how tragedy unfolded. According to prosecutors, the chain of events began days before the violence itself. Travel arrangements were made from New York to South Florida. Airline records and transportation data would later become central pieces of evidence. The journey alone raised significant questions because it suggested intention. Crossing state lines is not a spontaneous act. It requires planning, scheduling, and deliberate effort. Once in Florida, investigators alleged that the suspect moved with purpose. Digital records reportedly showed the use of a rideshare service to reach Kayla's apartment complex in Tamarack during the early morning hours of July 13, 2022. Surveillance cameras in and around the apartment complex captured critical footage, timestamps that prosecutors would later present in court to establish presence at the scene. The timing was significant. The visit occurred when most residents were asleep. Early morning hours often mean fewer witnesses and quieter surroundings. Prosecutors argued this detail supported the theory of premeditation.
At some point after arrival, the confrontation began inside Kayla's apartment. What happened in those moments became one of the most contested aspects of the trial. However, what investigators found afterward painted a violent picture. When first responders entered the apartment, they discovered Kayla suffering from multiple stab wounds. The scene was described as brutal and chaotic. Blood evidence indicated a violent struggle had taken place. The number and severity of the wounds would later be emphasized by prosecutors to argue intent and sustained aggression. Forensic teams processed the apartment carefully. Every surface, every object, every trace of blood was documented. Patterns of blood spatter can reveal movement, where someone stood, whether there was pursuit, whether the attack was prolonged. These silent details often speak louder than testimony. Meanwhile, digital forensics added another layer to the timeline. Phone data, rideshare logs, and communication records helped investigators narrow down precise windows of time. Technology rarely lies. Timestamps create structure in a case built on conflicting narratives. Authorities also examined the suspect's actions immediately after the incident. Movements away from the apartment complex were tracked. Surveillance footage and transportation data reportedly showed efforts to leave the area. Prosecutors argue that post-crime behavior can reveal consciousness of guilt, suggesting awareness of wrongdoing rather than confusion or panic. The defense, however, would later argue that the confrontation escalated unexpectedly. They claimed the encounter was not pre-planned to end in death. Instead, they suggested the situation spiraled out of control inside the apartment. But prosecutors countered with the structured timeline: the travel, the early morning arrival, the alleged disguise, and the digital evidence, presenting it as a sequence too deliberate to be accidental. One of the most powerful aspects of any homicide case is physical evidence. Unlike memory, it does not fade or change under pressure. Forensic findings often become the backbone of prosecution arguments. In this case, the sheer violence of the scene was central to their claim that the attack was intentional and sustained. By the time the timeline was fully assembled, investigators had constructed a narrative that stretched from New York to Florida, from airport terminals to apartment hallways, from digital records to a crime scene soaked in evidence. Each piece, flight records, surveillance video, rideshare data, forensic analysis, functioned like a puzzle fragment. Alone, each detail might seem small. Together, they formed a comprehensive picture of what prosecutors described as a calculated chain of events. The crime timeline transformed the case from emotional speculation into measurable facts. Minutes mattered, locations mattered, data mattered, and in court, those details would be examined frame by frame, second by second.
Because in the end, homicide investigations are not just about what happened. They are about proving when, how, and with what level of intent. And according to the prosecution's reconstruction, the timeline told a story of planning, confrontation, violence, and escape. A sequence that would ultimately shape the jury's understanding of what occurred inside that Tamarack apartment. When the case moved from the crime scene to the courtroom, the focus shifted from what happened to how it would be legally defined. The trial became the battleground where two completely different narratives collided, one presented by prosecutors, the other by the defense. At the center of it all was Sakina Thompson, now facing a charge of first-degree murder in the killing of Kayla Hodgson. From the very beginning, the prosecution framed the case as premeditated. They argued that this was not a spontaneous act fueled by sudden emotion, but a deliberate decision made long before the confrontation ever began. Travel records, digital footprints, and surveillance footage were introduced to demonstrate planning. According to the state, the journey from New York to Florida was the first clear indicator that the attack had been calculated. Prosecutors carefully walked the jury through the timeline. They highlighted the early morning arrival at Kayla's apartment in Tamarack, the alleged use of disguise, and the rideshare records that placed Thompson at the scene. Each piece of evidence was presented to support one central argument: intent. The prosecution emphasized the severity of the attack. The number of stab wounds, the forensic findings, and the condition of the scene were described in detail. They argued that the violence was excessive and sustained, not consistent with a brief struggle for survival. In their view, the physical evidence contradicted any claim of accidental or defensive action. But when the defense began presenting its case, the narrative shifted dramatically. Thompson took the stand and admitted to stabbing Kayla. However, she claimed it was an act of self-defense. According to her testimony, the confrontation escalated after Kayla allegedly struck her first. She described being injured during the altercation and stated that she blacked out during the struggle, only regaining awareness after the fatal injuries had already been inflicted. This claim introduced reasonable doubt as the defense's primary strategy. They argued that while Thompson traveled to Florida, she did not intend to commit murder. Instead, they suggested that emotions flared, a physical fight broke out, and the situation spiraled beyond control. The defense also emphasized her mental state at the time. They suggested that fear and shock may have impaired judgment. In some reports, it was revealed that Thompson was pregnant during the incident, a detail the defense implied could have heightened emotional vulnerability and panic.
Courtroom testimony became intense and highly emotional. Witnesses were called to discuss forensic findings. Experts explained blood spatter patterns and injury analysis. Digital records were scrutinized. Cross-examinations challenged timelines and interpretations. The prosecution repeatedly returned to one key point: preparation. They argued that you do not accidentally board a plane, arrange transportation, and arrive at someone's residence before dawn without a purpose. In their closing arguments, they described the sequence of events as methodical rather than impulsive. The defense, however, urged jurors to consider the possibility that the meeting was meant to be a confrontation, not a killing. They argued that fear can trigger irrational reactions and that self-defense, even when chaotic, is not murder. For the jury, the decision came down to intent. Was this a calculated act of revenge rooted in jealousy, or a confrontation that turned violent in an unpredictable and tragic way? The courtroom became a place where emotion met evidence. Legal definitions replaced speculation. Words like premeditation, self-defense, and reasonable doubt were no longer abstract concepts. They became the framework through which Kayla's death would be judged. Ultimately, the jury rejected the self-defense claim. They found Sakina Thompson guilty of first-degree murder. Their verdict signaled that they believed the prosecution had proven intent beyond a reasonable doubt. But the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was the final chapter in determining how this tragedy would be remembered, not just as a violent confrontation, but as a crime defined by planning, evidence, and accountability under the law. In that courtroom, two versions of the truth were presented, and after examining every detail, the jury chose the one they believed the evidence supported. When the jury returned to the courtroom after deliberations, the atmosphere was heavy. Weeks of testimony, forensic analysis, digital records, and emotional arguments had all led to this single moment. The fate of Sakina Thompson would now be decided, and the legal chapter of Kayla Hodgson's story would reach its conclusion. The verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. With that decision, the jury confirmed that they believed the killing was premeditated. They rejected the claim of self-defense and accepted the prosecution's argument that the crime was intentional and planned. In the eyes of the law, the evidence had met the highest burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt. But while the verdict provided legal clarity, it did not erase the loss.
During sentencing, the courtroom once again became a place of emotion. Family members of Kayla were given the opportunity to speak. Victim impact statements are often some of the most powerful moments in any trial. They shift the focus away from legal definitions and back to human consequences. Loved ones described the pain of losing a daughter, a relative, a friend. They spoke about empty chairs at family gatherings, birthdays that would never feel the same, and a future that had been stolen. The judge ultimately sentenced Thompson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the most severe punishment available short of capital sentencing. The message was unmistakable. The justice system viewed the crime as deliberate and irreversible. For Kayla's family, the sentence brought a form of accountability. It ensured that the person responsible would never again walk free. Yet, even the strongest sentence cannot restore what was lost. Justice in the courtroom does not equal healing at home. The impact of the case extended beyond the immediate families. It sparked conversations about jealousy-driven violence, emotional obsession, and the role social media can play in escalating personal conflicts. In a world where relationships are increasingly visible online, disputes that once remained private can quickly become amplified. This case became a stark reminder of how unchecked emotions, when combined with fixation, can lead to catastrophic outcomes. There was also broader reflection on premeditated violence in romantic conflicts. Prosecutors described the crime as a tragic example of what can happen when rejection turns into resentment and resentment turns into action. It forced many observers to confront uncomfortable questions. At what point does emotional distress become dangerous? How do warning signs get overlooked? Could anything have prevented the escalation? For the community in Tamarack, the case shattered the sense of normalcy. Tamarack was not known for high-profile violent crime. The brutality of the incident and the interstate nature of the travel drew national attention. Residents were reminded that even quiet communities are not immune to deeply personal acts of violence. As media coverage gradually faded, one reality remained unchanged. Kayla's life ended at just 23 years old. Her dreams, plans, and relationships were permanently interrupted. While legal proceedings can define guilt and impose punishment, they cannot measure the full weight of a life cut short. In the end, the case stands as both a legal conclusion and a cautionary story. It highlights the devastating consequences of unresolved jealousy, emotional fixation, and calculated retaliation. It demonstrates how digital evidence, travel records, and forensic science now play central roles in modern homicide prosecutions. And most importantly, it reminds us that behind every courtroom headline is a human life that mattered. The verdict closed the legal file. The sentence ensured accountability, but the impact, emotional, familial, and societal, continues far beyond the courtroom walls. And that is where the story ultimately rests, not only in the punishment delivered, but in the lasting reminder of how quickly personal conflict can spiral into irreversible tragedy.